As society got safer and life got more comfortable, and the trials and tribulations required of humans just to survive became less, did you feel that it was inevitable that we would arrive at a point of mass infantilization?
I'm not sure it's inevitable, but I mean, I see what you're saying, and you may be right. By most empirical metrics, we are kind of safer than we ever have been, free of the kind of devastations and diseases that affected our forebears. And so at one level, we should be celebrating this and sort of saying, well, hang on, this is a cause for, embracing life, because we have this kind of improvement in our lifestyle and our health and so forth, and even things like natural disasters and so forth. But it hasn't happened. We've kind of gone the other way, haven't we? And we've collapsed emotional and physical safety together. So we're now extremely worried and concerned about every eventuality. We catastrophize. We kind of allow ourselves to be sucked into worst case scenario thinking, whether it be about climate change or health scares and so forth. So yeah, it's a sort of strange irony, really, that we're safe. On one hand, we're safer than we've ever been. On the other hand, we're kind of more paranoid and more sort of hysterical almost about risk aversion and so forth. So there's a kind of irony there.
When was the last time you saw a TV ad that showed adults behaving like adults? How did we devolve within just one generation from people like me who couldn't wait to get a driver's license to teenagers nowadays who barely even seem to register any excitement at the driver's test or at the prospect of their first set of car keys, or apartment keys for that matter? Keith Hayward has some theories and a lot of research to back it up. A professor of criminology at Copenhagen University, he's also the author of Infantilised, How Our Culture Killed Adulthood. Hayward argues that Western society and media are basically conspiring to keep kids less mature than previous generations, leading to a situation where more and more of them fail, and in many cases barely even try to graduate into the basic self-reliance that characterizes adulthood. But that's not the worst part. It's one thing for some folks to party forever or deliberately fail to launch. It is quite another to imagine a society full of kid-ults who simply refuse, full stop, to ever grow up.
How did you develop your interest in the first place in the infantilization of Western culture?
That's a good question. Well, I didn't start by looking at Western culture, because that's a huge subject. I think the first thing I noticed was the way I was being spoken to by advertisers and marketers in TV commercials, especially car commercials. And I thought, why are they addressing me like I'm a child through wacky racist commercials and also cartoonification? And I sort of thought back to my father's era and the things that concerned my father when he bought a car. It's a million miles away from the messaging that's associated with car marketing today. And then I noticed this everywhere else, not just in advertising, even if it's banking or making a will. There was this kind of childlike motifs being employed in the advertising, cutesy jingles and daft songs. And then I sort of noticed it with my students who began to emerge on campus. How can I put this delicately? Perhaps less well-equipped to deal with the rigors of a university education, which, require people to become adult. The goal is that, you leave childish things behind and you move forward into adulthood on a university campus. And it seemed to me that my students were becoming, let's say, not all of them, of course, but some of them were becoming not well-equipped for that transition, and also seeking the kind of safetyism that you're talking about. And for a while, I wrote a couple of articles, the sort of things that academics do. I wrote a couple of journal articles in boring academic journals, and I thought that would be it, and I'll move on to other things. Right. But you know what? It wouldn't go away. I just couldn't leave this subject. And of course, I was increasingly bombarded with infantilized developments. You go to the train station and somebody's telling you to drink water and remain hydrated.
As if I don't know how to drink water.
I've managed to do that for 50 years. I mean, I don't need somebody telling me to carry a bottle of water. Going to a museum and seeing signage that says you might find these things upsetting or troubling or problematic. Well, again, this is kind of new to me. So it was something that I tried to walk away from, but the pang of the subject became more intense. And in the end, I said, you know what, I'm going to write this book. And as you can see from the size of this thing, it's a significant piece of work. Took me a lot of time to complete it. I'm not sure whether it was the right thing to do, but at least I'm having a conversation with you about it anyway, so that's a good thing at least.
Well, I'm glad you wrote the book. Just the other day, I got an email from my daughter's school saying, we would like to have a phone conversation with you about your daughter's chances, because we need to explain about whether she'll be appropriate for gifted and talented. And my first thought was, I don't have an hour for this nonsense. Give me a yes or a no. So anyway, I get on the phone with these lovely women who are talking to me as if I may need medications. You know, we have looked at your daughter. We want to tell you so many wonderful things we see about her. She's so communicative. However, we don't think we want to recommend her for gifted and talented for X whatever reason. And I said, okay. And they said, that's it? I said, yeah, what do you expect me to say? Like, I'm sorry, have I given you the impression that I would be upset? And they both said, no, it's not you. It's just all the parents.
Well, is it?
That's why I was really excited.
Never until your book have I seen anybody take it to the next level and talk about how society overall has changed, but beginning with the way the individual awakens to their place in society. So the larger question is, you know, the crux of your book. When and how did we as a society stop raising children to see adulthood as something to aspire to? Because that's where we are.
Lots of people email me with their experiences and say, thanks for writing the book because I had this kind of experience. So, you know, interestingly, the fact that the school can't differentiate between the way they speak to you and the way they speak to your child, so they're speaking to you in that same manner, is itself a problem, right? Because it suggests a lack of the ability to distinguish between adults and young adults or children, right? They've got this script now, this emotionally laden script that's being used everywhere for everything. And as you say, that could even extend to things in the corporate or business environment where you kind of speak in this therapeutic language. So I think that's an interesting point that you experienced. But the other thing is I can take it from how you responded, is that you are not somebody that we would describe as a snowplow parent or a helicopter parent, somebody who hovers over their children and clears the way for them so they have an easy time in life. Now, what it might be is that school has a lot of those parents that do a lot of the heavy lifting for their kids, right, in a way that you don't. And so the school itself is now kind of inured to this, and we must handle the parents in certain ways because they're part of this in a way that they perhaps weren't in previous generations.
And it's disappointing. It's also frankly upsetting to me, not to go too much into my own story, but I thought, I don't even want them speaking to my daughter this way. The world does not revolve around you.
That's right. I mean, this whole thing about kind of creating this peer-to-peer discourse or form of communication. I mean, they're adults. They're there. Their job is to transfer knowledge decided upon from one self-confident generation to the generation that's coming below them, right?
Exactly.
They're not there to have a kind of emotional, therapeutic relationship about feelings and wellness and all these issues. This is not something that a school's primary goal is. It's an educational institution, okay? They've got duty of care and all those things that they've had for 100 years or so, but their business is education and delivering education in a way that's, I think, fundamentally changed. And from the book, I have a whole chapter on this kind of development, what I call the therapeutic turn in education. The worrying thing is, like a lot of the infantilizing tendencies that one identifies, is that they don't stop there. I mean, the universities, I've been working in universities for 30 years, and universities very much resemble this. You know, they've kind of lost some of their core values are being undermined because they want to actually do different things. They want to create sort of certain cultures and environments that, to my mind, are having a terribly infantilizing effect. So you asked me to go back to your question, when did all this start and how did this all emerge? Well, it is a long question and one that we probably could burn through most of our recording time. But as far as I can see, I trace a history of this in the book, but you could do other histories. Yeah. So I trace the history of infantilization to, 2 or 3 developments in society. But one of the ones that I spend a lot of time discussing is the changing in advertising practices that took place in the 1960s. Okay, so we all know about the counterculture revolution. We all know about the sort of, 60s student radicals trying to create a new form of politics that was more strident and had a series of goals that were often fought out on campuses in America and elsewhere. But there's an argument I make in the book where there was another kind of revolution that took place, and that was the revolution that happened in the advertising offices and the marketing suites, where a lot of advertisers quickly realized that what they needed to do was create what they call lifestyle advertising. And you could tap into some of these radical tendencies and the desire for self-expression. And this worked from the 60s onwards until you get to about the 1980s, when things start to change again. And then we have a new type of advertising form, postmodern advertising, which is highly ironic, and nothing is serious anymore. And everyone's inside the joke. And at that point in time, we then really see adult archetypes and adult values being undermined and being dramatically replaced with kind of youthful ideals, what I call Denisi calls the juvenilization of society. So a lot of this is triggered by advertising, marketing, and the market. I mean, I'm not a kind of rabid anti-capitalist figure, but the market has a lot of culpability in the way it's shaped the infantilizing discourse. And of course, things don't happen singularly. Our popular culture, our movies, our TV shows, our literature, all these things constitute what I call in the book culturally induced infantilization. So the idea that our culture is actively looking to regress us, i.e. to keep us in a state of youthful fascination with things that perhaps we should put away as we transition into adulthood.
I'm all for choice. And I'm also all for compassion. I'm all for all of these things. You will never hear me use the word woke in a pejorative. I think there's always room for compassion in the world. However, the argument that you made in terms of life stages blurring was fascinating to me. Can you define the historical life stages and how the blurring began?
Yeah. Okay. So around the same time as the changes in advertising and marketing, we also see some pretty profound changes taking place in psychology and psychiatry. And it's interesting, if you look back at some of that literature now or before the 60s or early 60s, it's very clear that psychodynamic theorists like Erik Erikson or minor figures like Arthur Chapman basically told a story about the life course, which was about oppositional life stages. So Chapman talks about the idea of the different breed of cat. And the different breed of cat is the idea that young people do not want to be like their parents. And their parents are very clear they do not want to have the same tastes and interests as their children. And so he talks about strategies, maneuvers, all kinds of practices and interpersonal dynamics that young people mobilize to differentiate themselves from adults, and indeed vice versa. Erik Erikson talked about series of stages in the life course. And his key term was identity crisis. And the identity crisis occurs if you do not move through the life course by recognizing the oppositional stage difference between one stage and the other. So you're clearly not the same person, in your declining years as you are, when you're finding yourself on the voyage of discovery as a teenager. And so the key thing is, as we
adolescent, adult, you can't
exactly, yeah. And there's other stages as well. I mean, Erikson had 8, but it's not so much about the particular stages. It's about the idea that as you move through life, you really want to reject some of the elements of your earlier position in the life course. And what we see now, or what's happened in our infantilized state, is that those kind of differentiated stages, or those oppositional life stages, are blurred. There's no one's really bothered anymore. So what I have this phrase called generational mulch. And generational mulch is the idea that everyone is having a very similar life experience. So I don't want to get into trouble with the Taylor Swift fans. I did a piece in the Danish press over here where I was very careful about what I said about Taylor Swift fans, because of course they're very passionate fan group.
They love them some Swift.
They do, but I'm not very familiar with the music or the culture. The interesting thing is about why parents going to Taylor Swift concerts with their, say, 17, 16, 18-year-old daughters, wearing the same gear, liking the same music, which is about boys and high schools and things. And, nothing wrong with that, liking that kind of music when you're a young person. But what on earth is the mother doing there? I mean, the example I often use is when I was a young man in England, I was very into sort of punk music and new wave music, which is often very, very different genre.
Would rather have poked out their own eyeballs than go to a Cure concert. Right.
First of all, that's true. My father would have just said, what on earth's going on? And quite right. I was deliberately choosing that music as a stratagem and a maneuver to create an oppositional distinction. Right. But worse, if my father even worse than that, if my father had, say, turned up Stranglers concert or something, I would have been the worst social death, an absolute social.
Completely.
Because the key thing is, it's not for you.
It's not for you.
It's for me. It's for my generation. It's for younger people. Now,
Right.
this is all part of this kind of oppositional notions of moving through the life course. You have this, and if you don't have these oppositional dynamics, then Erikson, the psychodynamic theorist, was very clear that it can lead to an identity crisis, all right, which is a kind of lack of maturity. And so I argue in the book quite a whole chapter on this, is that what we're experiencing is this generational mulch. Another way of thinking about this is when parents say that, you see this in Modern Family, that TV show, we're not parenting, we're peerenting. You heard this phrase of peering? So they're not my kid, they're my friend. Okay, there may be some value in that, and it may be healthy in many ways. But when I hear that, I think we've got a problem here.
Right.
And the problem here is that we're a loss of authority. And it's a bit like your schooling example from earlier. They're meant to be in an authoritative position.
Yeah.
Right? And the children are, subordinate to that authority. It's not all...
And protection, because it's authority and protection, and it was all together.
That's right. There's a very good reason for that. And if you shrink everything down so everyone's on the same kind of emotional, psychological level, they're all the same generational mulch experience, what you get, to quote the French aesthetic philosopher Paul Virilio, is you actually get the product of this is false adults and false children. So children are no longer children in the typical sense of being naive about the world or kind of needing instruction. And adults are no longer adults because they've lost their ability to act authoritatively. And so one of the consequences of generational mulch is that we're not just simply talking about infantilization, culturally induced infantilization. We're also talking about adultification. Adultification is the situation where young people grow up quicker because they're exposed to things, social media, technology more generally. They're exposed to things that previously they were kept away from. And so they're exposed to adult things, but they might not have the adult capacity emotionally to deal with them. So you have this very strange situation where you have children growing older quicker and adults staying younger longer. So what happens? People end up meeting in the middle. They become false adults and false children, and they have these shared kind of what you might call an adult-child amalgam, which is a kind of new emerging category. And don't take my word for it. This is actually how advertisers speak. They actually believe they're creating something called an adult-child amalgam. So a parallel would be, for example, if you think about the unisex era in the 60s, where you could sell products to both genders, or I know there's more genders these days, but in those days it was two genders. And so the idea that you would expand your market by being able to sell the same product to two different demographic groups. Well, the adult-child amalgam in advertising is fantastic because you can sell adult products to younger people, all right? And you can sell childish products, teenage products, if you like, to older people longer. So that it's lightsabers, it's Breaking Bad, jigsaw puzzles, it's Halloween costumes for adults. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the book is that this is how quickly things change. The Halloween market for adults is now bigger than the Halloween market for children by some way. 20 years ago, Halloween was a children's only event. But now, Halloween is a very adult event. And people dressing up, going out drinking, partying, and they've kind of taken the Halloween children's only event, and now it's become an adult phenomenon, which now absolutely outsells children's costumes.
And I guess the problem is people always wanted to reclaim their youth momentarily. People always wanted to enjoy feeling young again. That's not new. I'm sure my grandmother did things like that. I'm sure your grandmother did, but it was for a night, right? It wasn't a part of our personality. And I think the big challenge in your book is kind of, when did it become okay to live that way forever? I don't think it's just about parenthood. I think it has to do with when we hit a moment in the evolution of society where it became okay to never even aspire to be fully responsible for yourself. And that's horrifying, right? As I have children, I think about this stuff all the time, how I'm going to raise my children to be human adult people, right? Just just human adult people. It's not that complicated. So I guess one part of it is now all of society not only approves of, but sort of celebrates and elevates this idea of a never-ending youth. But if you are 47 or whatever, and you are living without a plan, I'm not sure you're okay. You're not going to convince me you're okay.
Yeah.
Right? So how does the infantilization of the individual person jump to the infantilization of society and jump to the overall tension in society that we feel? There's no more decorum. And you talked a little bit about adult tantrums, but my question is, can you paint that picture of how we go from the infantilization of the individual to the overall tantruming of society?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in what you just said there, and there's a kind
I
of
do long questions.
Yeah.
If you like.
Yeah. And so I may have to respond to kind of elements of what you said, and this issue about what comes first, the society or the individual. I mean, my view is that the individuals have been shaped by these cultural tendencies, culturally induced infantilization. So the individual has been primed to see this as acceptable.
Right.
Yeah, that's my view. If you go back to advertising, a little task for them to go and look at advertising and find out the next time they see an actual adult acting in adult ways. It's very hard to find. What you'll find is an adult figure who's usually the butt of the joke. If it's a father figure, very often the father knows nothing, the child knows everything. The archetypes of kind of what it means to develop, to be adult, to use the kind of term that you're using about behaving maturely, with decorum, with adult foresight, and all those things. Those kind of archetypes are few and far between these days. Even if you look at film, there's whole genres of film which justify the idea that it's okay to stay younger longer. And so, I mean, we've got now a sort of professional young adult class that like hedonism, right? They're very, very into their hedonism. And as you said, previously it's okay. And people have always wanted to stay young. Some of us are doing it worse than others in my case, but you know what I mean?
Right.
But the point is, there seems to be
the feeling is not new.
Yeah. Now, then realization that you're not going to live forever. Christopher Lasch, the sociologist, talked about kind of the infantile omnipotence, right? So the idea that if you stay in an infantile state, you believe you're in your own omnipotence, so you're going to live forever. I mean, in a way, some people will say, they listen to this and say, that's not a bad thing. You want to live forever in some kind of sense. But there's a realization, as an adult realization, that, actually you cannot party like you are 25 in your 40s. And there's something deeply embarrassing, isn't there, really, when you sort of see people hanging on in that way, right? So there's that, that's a kind of consequence of the erosion of adult archetypes and the idea that it's fine to stay younger, longer. And in fact, the market is actually celebrating that. It's doing everything it can actually to encourage that, because you spend more on things that previous generations wouldn't have spent their money on.
All right.
Right? Other people. I saw even today on the news, I was watching something where one of our members of parliament was talking about that his constituents who've got limited economic resources, one of their problems is they cannot budget their money. They have no ability to budget. So they're in difficult situations, economic, financial situations, but they're also hamstrung by their inability to budget. What is budgeting? Essentially, it's the delay of gratification and the idea that you need to put things away for other times in the future. So budgeting is really about that kind of farsightedness, or if you want, I want to call it that. It very much eroded. And one of the things that the market has done over 20, 30 years is to play up the idea of impulsivity, instant gratification, and delay, and get rid of this kind of Protestant sort of good husbandry, if I can use that term. But I did in one of my earlier books, I wrote a book about consumer culture and crime, called City Limits, Crime, Consumerism, and the Urban Experience. And in that book, I make some parallels between kind of some of the psychological states that enhance criminality and the psychological states that are good for consumerism and capitalism. And very often it's impulsivity, lack of self-control, failure to delay instant gratification,
like a consequence too.
Yeah, I mean, I remember sort of seeing adverts for banks, and the strap line on the banking advert was "Don't wait, have it now."
Right.
This is the bank, right? They're in the they're in the
You're
business
the
of like,
business of delayed gratification.
yeah, and of course, I mean, there's a whole literature on credit card debt, and Gina Twinch talks about the cascading effects of credit cards and how that can elongate or continue youth. So you can put everything on your credit card, you know, your plastic surgery, your new bags, and everything else. So actually, it's hard to disassociate really what the market's done by creating these emotional states through consumerism and the resulting infantilized individuals that we see out partying well past their youthful days, if you like. Now, again, people will say I'm being too, you know, people have said that I'm just a grumpy old guy, and, you know, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I like to go out. I like to have fun. Anyone who knows me will know that I like to, you know, enjoy myself in some of these settings. But yeah, like you say, I'm very aware that this is not really my milieu anymore. This is a young person's business. I feel out of place. Anyway.
And I think that's the point, right? The point is not that you should say to someone, who do you think you are for being there? The point is, if I see you and you are 55 and you are dancing somewhere at 4 a.m, I would hope it would be safe to assume that is not your normal Friday night. But if this is your whole personality, then I think you've missed some of the richness of life. And how do we get back to a universe where people understand that we're not vilifying, that you're not to be vilified for wanting to remember the feeling, but that there is something very, very dangerous about refusing to graduate.
Again, so the issue about fear of failure is, you know, to take chances, some chances, and to, you know, start a family, you know, there's a fear of failure in relationships and those things. But to be able to commit to those things, you need economic resources. But of course, and I mentioned this in the book, we have to think about the economic dimensions. I mean, house prices are just crazy. So, you know, most baby boomers had a mortgage by the time they're 25 because house prices were much more affordable. Now, you know, it costs a tremendous amount of money to start to own your own home without a deposit, if you're lucky, from your parents. What young people often say to me is that they feel screwed. They feel that the society has abandoned them, right? And not created the conditions for them to move through into the adult life course, right? I mean, a proper society, a meaningful democracy would address this problem, because they'd be worrying, they would worry about declining birth rates, and they would say we need to do something to make sure that young people can get on the housing ladder, all right? They would enact policies that would allow that to happen. But actually our culture does exactly the opposite. We've created a generational war where young people hate old boomers. You know, what's that phrase? Okay, boomer. You know,
okay,
shuts
boomer.
down. Yeah, and so we've created this generational war, and that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want everyone pitting against each other on the issue of economic resources. We want policies that can help young people to establish themselves. And I think, funnily enough, and this is getting off message a little bit, but I actually sense aspects of this in popular culture today, a kind of reaction against the hedonism that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So the emergence of this trad wife phenomenon, the emergence of people saying they want a simpler life, anti-consumerism, and, you know, even this off-grid existence you sometimes hear. A lot of this is a rejection of the modern world. And when I say the modern world, I mean the kind of things that we're talking about here. The markets, the world the market has created, the world that capitalism and consumerism created, the detraditionalization of the family, the erosion of family values, the erosion of community values. These are all consequences of changes that have taken place in the last 20 or 30 years. And I do sense that there are groups of people out there, young people, that actually would like to see some kind of return to the kind of traditionalism that I think you were getting at in your point about sort of lack of decorum and the idea of those kind of points. So it's a long way around the question, but
I do want to steer clear from kind of conveying that I would think being a parent is the only marker of adulthood to me, right? And that's not what we're saying, because it's very valid not to want to have kids. All those things are valid. What I think is we've lost in this infantilization is this idea of simple responsibility for the self.
And let me just be making a very valid point about sort of agency, taking control. So look, I just mentioned how responsibility. Okay, let's take a look at that. So I mentioned before about the difficult economic situation that young people find themselves in. I'm not trying to undermine it. It's a serious problem. Okay, I don't have any children, so I consider myself an adult. I don't have children, so I also don't believe that.
You seem pretty adult,
but I don't believe that adulthood is about having children or even getting married. I think that adulthood is a state of mind, and I'll come back to that. The point I want to make first is about this economic issue. So a lot of our older listeners, or your older listeners, not mine, will be listening to this perhaps thinking, well, guess what? This is not the first time we've had economic hardships. The Great Depression, most of human history, the majority of the people were facing incredible economic hardships. But what they did was the kind of thing you're suggesting, which is to embrace adulthood as an aspiration, to take agency of their situation. What they didn't do was exist in a regressive state of youth. And this is why it's unique. And this is why we're living in an infantilized world. The unique thing about it is that our response to economic hardship, or young people's response to economic hardship, even middle-aged people's response, is essentially to regress into or stay trapped in amber in this youthful state. Well, that's unique because previously economic hardships are not, they're common. People still marched on, they put their head down and marched into adulthood. Okay, exactly. So how do you do that? I mean, leaving the family home,
That's a big one. And I feel like if we could redefine as the third stage is when you just simply leave the parental home.
Yeah, well, that is a marker that they use in some of the demographic data as the demographic markers for adults is leaving, having your own dwelling outside the family home. But there are other things too. I mean, we can, if you want to be philosophical about this and not just exist in the realm of economics, other things that you can do, right, to be an adult, right? You can become a critical thinker. You don't become catastrophized. Don't be paranoid by fear. Educate yourself. You don't need to go to university and get loads and loads of degrees to continue this. That's credentialism, all right? That's credentialism.
Right.
Many people can teach themselves, and it's not just about academic subjects. It's about teaching yourself about life. Become a critical thinker. Don't accept what you hear. Don't listen to media and advertising and take it as a kind of architecture for life. Create your own idea of what you want to be and where you want to go and how to get there, right? I don't want to sound too self-helpy because I don't read those books. I've got no idea what's in those things. I'm not really, that's not my kind of thing. But I think, for me, university at least was a profound experience because I felt like I was living on my own. But more importantly, I was being exposed to all kinds of things that were happening that were adults. Relationships, knowledge, and all these things, interacting with professors and different timbers of conversation. If our universities have become infantilized, we kind of stop that happening at the universities. So then it happens outside the universities and expands the infantilized state of teenagerdom longer and longer. But don't exist in that world. There's things you can do. You can embrace adulthood without it being a kind of death sentence, right? Ignore these hectoring censors that exist in our culture and act independently. You're your own best critic, if you want, about what you feel you need at a certain time. Act on those instincts. Don't let passively things wash over you and accept our culture. We're also consumers, so we can vote with our feet, right? Yeah. Don't, get these culture industries to change. And there's some evidence that they are, right?
Part of what you're doing, though, is recommending that people, almost like you're saying, stop being so infantilized by acting more like an adult, right? Because if someone can take the presence of mind to say, I'm just going to watch the thing, and if it freaks me out, then I'll deal with it. That's an adult, take responsibility for yourself way of walking through the world. And then it brings me to this, you're talking about critical thinking, right? Not just accepting what you're being given. And one of the things you talk about is political discourse. It does feel like genuine political discourse is gone. Nobody's trying to learn anymore. So drawing that line, I think you do this well in your book, drawing that line from the infantilization of individuals in Western culture to the political extremism was powerful. But I think it goes much deeper than that, right? Because it's in every aspect of life now. People are just afraid. And I wonder how we can extrapolate to what we should be teaching young people today, not just our own kids, right? But your students.
Yeah. Well, there's sort of addressing two things there, or raising two things, really. The second issue is about the state of our public discourse, our political discourse, which is lamentable. It's terrible. I use the phrase infantocracy to describe the current, and I whether it's Boris Johnson, Trudeau, or whatever, they're infantocrats, all right? These are not people that you would look to. I don't think you should look to them for moral advice or as intellects. They're simply not. They're people that, have debased our political culture. And so that's a problem in our politics, and we can come back to talk about that. But you also mentioned something previous to that, which was this idea of sort of safetyism at universities, or the idea that people being protected. And of course, there's a lot of crossover there between these two things that you've raised. And so one of the things is about sort of trigger warnings or safe spaces or safetyism at universities is that essentially what's going on here is that you're trying to smooth out the world, all right? You're trying to make the world acceptable to you as an individual and your values and your beliefs. And that is not a good basis for political debate or for political agreement between different factions. So these things are connected. I mean, somebody wrote to me the other day, and quite a funny story about university life these days. And this person's a very well-known criminologist who teaches a very popular course on homicide, murder, essentially murder rates and so forth. And he got an email from a student that said, "I've got a problem with. I've picked your course, but I've got a problem, which is I'm triggered by the word murder." And so his advice was, "Well, this is not the course for you, okay?" But think about that. I mean, the idea that, you know, that person was going to write to the convener of the course and say, I guess what they were saying is, can you adapt that course to my concern, my anxieties, which, you know, may be justified. But the point is, of course, no, one can't. No. One has to deal with that situation. And it's up to that person to try to manage that process. Hopefully they did the course and they weren't triggered and it was a happy, I don't know what happened, but it's the kind of sort of entitlement issues around what they're really saying is the world is difficult out there and there's lots of things that I don't agree with or are problematic. And I need somebody to smooth it out and make it tolerable for me to function. All kinds of bizarre things happen if that is not pushed back against. I think most academics are pretty good. And I also see with my own students that actually young students today are fed up with trigger warnings. They're getting fed up with this kind of culture. They say, look, let us decide. It's quite refreshing, actually. Because, I mean, I may be a grumpy old man, but I'm not negative about young people. I want to be clear in this podcast that, I mean, a lot of the book is really about a defense of young people and what can we do to help them and improve their situation. So I'm heartened to see that a lot of my students are saying that we don't give us trigger warnings. Don't, you know, we can handle it. And I find that a very interesting development. I'm pleased to see it. Now, when it comes to politics, I mean, the reality is if you want political transformation to take place, if you want good things to happen, all right? And this is, of course, the case throughout history, right? If you wanted gender discrimination laws, if you want maternity leave, if you want these things to happen, you have to have grassroots mass support, all right? The problem we've got now is because everyone's inside their bubble, everyone's got their own views, their own positions, their own relationship to certain issues that they're very passionate about, it becomes harder to build that consensus. So shared values, shared views, shared issues are increasingly hard to develop if you exist in this world where what matters is the self. What matters is my issues. What matters is my narcissistic opinions or whatever it is. You've broken the world up into 1,000 intersectional shards. All right? That is very good if you don't want political transformation at a democratic level to take place. But for things to happen politically, you have to recognize that your uniqueness is subsidiary to the actual issue you want, the better society that you want. And that's something that we probably all want, right? That's something we would all want. Add to that, our political class, as I mentioned earlier, are terrible. They're the worst political class we've had in 100 years. Right. They're not very smart. They exist in a world of sound bites. They think if they say the same sound bite over and over again, their message is going to cut through. And then you add into this, they're so bad, in fact, that we've now opened the door to the celebrity politician.
Oh, God.
So I talk a lot about that in the book. I talk about this whole idea of celebrity politics and the idea of it's bad enough to be told what to think by barely educated politicians. Now we're being told what to think by entirely uneducated celebrities, right? It's itself a kind of teenagerdom, a fandom kind of legacy of youth, isn't it? I like their music, so I must adhere to their politics. It's the sort of thing that a 16-year-old fanboy or girl would do, right? So it's a terrible situation we're in politically. I'm not totally negative or dystopian about it. I think there could be some signs of change occurring.
So when I think about the issues of politics right now, I think the only real thing to do is to worry about the next generation, right? Which brings us back to the world of education and the world of higher learning and what we're doing to build the next generation of politicians. And so you talk a little bit about promoting self-esteem, right? Promoting self-esteem over learning.
No, well, I think self-esteem is a pretty useless concept, actually.
That's what I'm saying.
If it's been promoted.
We promoted
self-esteem to become a kind of almost like a sort of metaphysics, this idea of self-esteem and self-worth. It's not what education should be doing, essentially. It should be sticking to its core principles.
Education, I think at its highest, should be a safe space where other concerns are protected such that you can focus on the learning. But I agree with you that to some extent this vulnerability has been weaponized, so that it's become a little bit kind of, the world was too harsh and too unyielding before in school before you know what I mean? Like it was too harsh and too unyielding for reality. And that was not safe. And it was impossible to bring your whole self to the world of education. Now, I also agree the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. I'm not a big fan of the idea of trigger warnings everywhere. I'm not a big fan of it. The question is, where do we draw the line? Like, personally, I'm not offended by a lot of these things. I'm not offended by simple things like, what are your pronouns? They don't offend me. It costs me nothing to respect the pronoun. If that's what it takes for us to be able to have the conversation, please tell me how you want to be addressed. However, the idea that it costs us nothing to display compassion is different than the idea that cultural sensitivity should be weaponized, right? I wonder, what is the line for you in an ideal world right now with your students?
Well, I mean, lots of what you say there, I would agree with. And, especially the idea that, previous eras were not perfect. I mean, but you mentioned this pendulum overcompensating, swinging too far in the other direction. And I would think that's probably about where we are at the moment. So, for example, in my own teaching practice, there's a new term started last week. I teach a course on criminological theory at my university.
And how old are the students?
Well, they're probably in their early 20s. So they're master's postgraduate students on law programs. So they're doing my course, which is about crime. And I say at the start of the course, I say, in this course, you'll see images behind me on my PowerPoint slides that are about moments of violence, brutality, and crime. And I'll say it once. That's it. Because I'm not teaching tiddlywinks. I'm teaching crime, and it's a tough business, right? And so I say, just bear in mind that, every now and again, because I discuss terrorism and terrorism atrocity and genocide and things like this. And so I say it once at the start of the course, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's a responsible thing to do, just a bit of forewarning. But I'm not going to go into a kind of a constant sense of creating emotional safe spaces or whatever it is. I mean, I consider myself to be fairly compassionate, right? I think most academics, would say that the same. But I think compassion is one thing, but you don't have to preface everything you're doing with a sort of censoriousness about what can be shown or what can't be shown. I'm all for compassion. I'm also like, I'm politically correct. Not like I'm sort of some ancient figure. There's no, one has to be in my business. But the point is, I think there's a worry, isn't there? There's a worry that if you overemphasize this kind of discourse, then things can start to bleed into areas that are problematic. Because I don't want it to be a sense where, when I'm discussing something historical or something that's, an atrocity or something, that I have to sort of keep caveating it all the time. Yeah. Because it creates this kind of, this has happened a lot, it's thought and language policing. Mm-hmm. And that's what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid that, I think.
We do. And I think at the end of the day, if you are leading with some sense of compassion and trying to convey some sense of compassion, I would hope you're okay as an educator. But the problem is that's not guaranteed anymore. So the question for you is, are you hopeful that we will be less infantilized moving forward?
Yes, I am, as a matter of fact. I mean, it might not.
Why?
It might not look it when you see the book but I'm in the education business, so most of my time is spent, teaching younger people, and I don't find them to be that bad. I find them to be good. I find them to be interesting, thoughtful, not particularly hamstrung by the kind of culture we're talking about. I think there are things happening in society which at the moment, they're very nascent, they're very developing, but they may be significant. We're already moving into this, I'm sure you've heard about this idea of phone-free schools, and the idea of removing Yeah. Okay. So, what's going on there? Well, this is Jonathan Haidt's work, and it's been very influential to get these phones out of the classroom. And guess what? It turns out the kids in the schools, once they get over their kind of the remorse of losing their phone or whatever tablet, they actually have a better experience. Right. And there's other data that can be shown about things like viewing habits. So if you show people a bunch of crap and that's their diet, they're going to watch it. But actually, if you show people more intelligent, thoughtful things, they actually prefer it.
Right.
Now, at the moment, there's not enough people searching out these things. And this is to do with, that's not their fault, it's to do with the schedulers, the programmers, the people in the corporations that make these things, right? But the actual appetite, I think, is there. I think one of the things we're seeing, strangely enough, is people are seeking out alternatives to mainstream popular culture. Mm-hmm. They're seeking out them on themselves, but oftentimes they're seeking out things that might not be the best things. Yeah. So young men, for example, are going into the manosphere and seeking out, say, Andrew Tate's or whatever. I did a whole
episode on that.
Okay. I'm not. You'll be more an expert than I on this, but I mean, the problem is that some people will look for these things and they'll find that's where they'll land, because they're looking for an alternative diet to the kind of mainstream. And what we've got to do is we've got to try it, and that's why I'm in education. I mean, I spend a lot of time. Look at this. Have you seen this? All my courses have a filmography, and try to get people to look at other things from across the political spectrum that are going to be challenging them. You cannot challenge people if you exist inside a safety-first curriculum that does not allow people to be, we'll say, upset, but be moved or be challenged by content that they're not used to, that's outside of their normal diet, their normal mainstream, or it might well be their kind of filter bubble, existence, whatever language you want to use to describe that.
Well, I'm all for people getting outside of their bubble, and more than anything, I am for people seeing the systems around them and how they're being affected, because we did evolve to adhere to the herd, and we evolved to that for our own survival. The problem is now we're taking in whatever we're given and we're believing it. So books like yours at least help us think a little bit more critically about what's going on around us.
I think people are a bit more sophisticated than we give them credit for. And I think one of the things that I've noticed with this book is, yes, the infantilizing dynamic is at play. It's everywhere. It's in our politics, it's in our movies, it's in our literature, it's in our art, it's in our universities and schools. It's all around us. But I also see that, there isn't evidence to suggest that people are beginning to recognize that and are beginning to react against it. It's not always the case that people just follow what they're given. I mean, I think people are a bit more discerning, and what we should try and do is create young people that are more discerning. That's what it should be doing, right? Is creating that discernment within young people.
Well, I think we're both trying to do our part.